No pub, no church, no shops. Just 20 or so houses, a few farms, and some workshops for the mentally handicapped. This quiet little hamlet in Germany's lower Rhineland is called Groin. Groin was not always this peaceful, as veterans of the 5th Battalion Seaforth Highlanders well remember. In March 1945, the action they fought here needed every ounce of stamina and determination they possessed, and vividly illustrates the dynamics and realities of a battalion in battle. The fighting at Groin was part of Operation Plunder, the crossing of the Rhine, an event with a special significance for the Allied troops.
The Rhine, of course, was something which we'd thought about from El Alamein, Sicily, France, Belgium, Holland. None of us had seen it. But we all had our own sort of stupid ideas of what it might be looked like. And I think living near Edinburgh, the only thing I could possibly liken it would be maybe the 1st and 4th, yeah. So it was a formidable obstacle. How it expected us to go across in little canvas boats, none of us knew. We were a bit scared for that.
Some 450 meters wide, and with a current averaging 3.5 knots, the river was no Firth of Forth, but its psychological influence on the Allied troops was considerable. No matter where the border was marked on their maps, to them the Rhine was the true natural frontier of Hitler's Germany and the last obstacle to victory. Once across it, the end would be in sight. 3 weeks before Operation Plunder, the 5th Seaforths had been withdrawn to rest and train for the crossing. But until then, they had been involved in the bitter fighting in the battle to clear the west bank of the river.
There was a feeling that they had almost reached the end of their tether. But of course, reinforcements kept arriving, and spirit, I think, picked up quite quickly. The battalion was always on the strength wherever we went. In fact, most times we went into action with 3 companies rather than 4, and most companies had perhaps only 3/4 of their normal strength. But the spirit was high.
In the British Second Army sector, 30 Corps was to secure a bridgehead, including Rees and Halden, and push towards Alton. The assault was to be led by the 51st Highland Division, with the Canadian 9th Infantry Brigade under command, and would attack 2 brigades up. 153 Brigade, with the 2nd Seaforths of 152 Brigade under command, was to capture Rees and block the north and northeast approaches to the town. And 154 Brigade would capture the small villages on the left. Then the 9th Canadian and 152 Infantry Brigades would follow through to secure the bridgehead as quickly as possible, so that rafts and bridges could be built free from enemy fire to speed the build-up and the subsequent breakout. Unfortunately, the 51st Highland Division sector was where the commander of the German 1st Parachute Army, General Alfred Schlemm, had deployed his 3 strongest parachute or Fallschirmjäger divisions. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Division, the 8th Fallschirmjäger Division, with a fighting strength of about 7,500 men, and the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division with some 5,800. The divisions were greatly under strength. Less than 1% of the troops were parachute trained. Many were very young, hastily trained replacements. But they were bound by a proud tradition and a small cadre of well-trained, battle-hardened veterans. The Fallschirmjäger divisions were by far the strongest German formations in the West. The river line was thinly held, with the main strength of the divisions deployed further back to cover key routes, villages, industrial complexes, and farm buildings. Field fortifications were not highly developed, but defense zones had been created by digging anti-tank ditches to link the numerous natural water obstacles, and demolitions had been prepared. There was little wire, and few mines had been laid. The 51st Highland Division's priorities were to seize crossing points over natural and man-made obstacles, to open up routes, block the movement of enemy reinforcements, and to capture Rees, where Schlemm had deployed an elite unit.
I commanded the 1st Parachute Army Assault Battalion, which was entirely made up of volunteers. They were all paratroopers and had a lot of battle experience, for we had been together a long time.
Instead of 170 men strong, each of Hauptmann Hubner's 4 companies had about 100, and to compensate for lack of numbers, he opted for a mobile defence. Holes were smashed in drains and sewers, and tunnels were driven through the rubble to enable his paratroopers to move quickly from one firing point to another. It was as crucial for the Germans to hang on to Rees as it was for the 51st Highlanders to capture it, for the town dominated the Rhine and the surrounding country. Until the German OPs could be put out of action, fire could be brought down on the all-important crossing and bridging sites.
As a troop commander, I was taken forward with the other officers to a viewing point, which was a small farmhouse which had a view over a dike right down to the Rhine.
We could see the sort of plain, the floodplain in front of us, and this high dike on our side of the Rhine. But we couldn't tell much about the crossing because Monty's plan had been to disguise our efforts and cover our efforts and our preparations by a smoke screen, which sort of drifted down the river from huge canisters farther up towards Holland. We couldn't tell the width of the river or what was on the other side.
There may not have been a great deal to see, but they got a feel for the ground, and anyway the intelligence concerning the enemy was accurate. On the morning of March the 23rd, the 5th Seaforce were briefed by their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Sim.
He took great care in everything he did, every battle that was laid on. He took meticulous care. He gave out his orders crisply and easy to understand. And I got the impression that he probably worried more after the battle than when he was giving out his orders. I think he felt, well, this is what I feel is correct. This I will do. And it's only when heavy casualties list come in that he said, well, maybe I could have done it another way. But he did the best he could. An excellent officer.
During the briefing, the divisional commander, Major General Rennie, paid the battalion an informal visit.
I can't remember a great deal about it except the one sentence came through that this was the final crust of the German forces that had to be broken. But he mentioned that they were paratroopers, and we were not too excited about that. The paratroopers were highly proficient, highly experienced soldiers, and we knew that this time there would be no going through without a fight.
The die was cast. And at 1700 hours on March the 23rd, the artillery opened the account.
It was tremendous. The sky was lit up. The noise was deafening. Nothing that I'd ever seen or heard in my life before could compare with it. But of course it was a bit encouraging to think that there was this enormous barrage going forward.
As to its effect, the commander of a German artillery regiment recorded in his diary that our small house rocked as if in a force 10 gale. It would have been madness to order the gunners to the guns. Not even a mouse could come out of its hole without being turned into a sieve.
Ja, das ging ununterbrochen, das Trommelfeuer. Ne, und die schossen hier mal ganz an.
The shells were landing everywhere, from Rees to behind Millingen. The ground was completely churned up from the shells, which landed one after another. Our telephone lines were destroyed, and to maintain communications, I had to move between regimental headquarters and the battalions. When possible, I used a bicycle, but the shelling frequently forced me to use ditches.
At 2100 hours, 4 hours after the opening of the bombardment, the leading brigades crossed the Rhine, and at 2300 hours, the 5th Seaforths began a long march forward to a waiting area behind the flood dyke.
As the night wore on, it became colder, and we began to shiver. We perhaps, there's a bit of fear in it as well. When your knees knock, you sometimes wonder if it's cold or if it's maybe just a bit scared of what's ahead of you.
And one of the highlights here was a mug of tea laced with rum, which is a very seldom occurrence. It happened very, very seldom. But we lay there for quite a while, and the mist began to come down. My goodness. We were chilled to the bone, all of us, before we got moving. And we lay right through until just before daylight, when a sapper appeared on top of the dyke, shouting, "It's your turn."
It was 0630 hours, and the 5th Seaforths was the last of the 51st Highland Division's battalions to cross. By this time, many of the 35 storm boats provided had been knocked out by enemy fire, and only 2 of the 3 crossing points were operating, one with only 2 boats.
They were mainly canvas and timber, with an outboard motor which ferried them across. As we looked across the river, which was about 450 yards wide at that point, doesn't seem too far, but believe me, if you're sitting in a small boat and there's stuff coming down all around you, it is quite fearsome.
I think there was only about a couple of shells fell all the time we were going over. And we were within, what, maybe 30 yards of the far bank, when we could see the track that our earlier brigades had gone up. And there's quite a few dead soldiers lying up the track.
The DD tanks crossed at about the same time. Until rafts and bridges were operating, the only armoured support available to the 5th Seaforths would be a troop of these duplex-drive amphibious tanks.
My personal concerns, of course, were that this was the first time I had seen any action. I was therefore totally inexperienced as to what it would be like. But we swam out towards the middle of the river, and the current was considerable, so that we were taken downstream a long way. There was shells and mortars dropping in the water all around us. One prayed and hoped that one wasn't hit. Unfortunately, one of my 4 tanks was hit, the one that my sergeant was in command of. I was hoping and praying we would arrive at a point where it was possible to drive out sensibly, and luckily we were able to. Without much difficulty, we were able to drive out and drop the screens and assemble ourselves. And fairly quickly, my other 2 tanks were with me.
I know, as pleased as dog with 2 tails to get on her feet on the other side, even although we're stepping over dead soldiers, dead Jocks. Here at last was security. I mean, you had none on the water in a canvas boat.
My first memory was an unfortunate one, because Donny MacLeod, who was in charge of the carriers, had crossed with the previous brigade to Wrecker route, and one of the first persons I saw was Donny MacLeod. Unfortunately, he'd been killed. He was dead, and it wasn't an auspicious start to the day for me.
He was killed by mortar fire, which was a sad blow for Lieutenant Lyle. He and Lieutenant MacLeod had been good friends since the Desert War and were commissioned together in Sicily. The battalion had 2 plans for the capture of Groin and the bridge over the anti-tank ditch beyond. The one to be used depended on the outcome of Lieutenant MacLeod's patrol. If it could capture a crossing point over an anti-tank ditch on the Rees-Halden road intact, the battalion was to pass through the 2nd Seaforths and advance along the main road. If that was not possible, then, once the 5th Camerons had captured a large brickworks, the 5th Seaforths would attack from the northwest. But following Lieutenant MacLeod's death, the patrol unaccountably did not continue. However, aerial reconnaissance had revealed that the main road was blocked by demolitions, so the 2nd plan was adopted. But first, the 5th Camerons had to capture the large brickworks of Imlure. They crossed the line of departure at 0825 hours, but met intense fire from well-prepared positions around the brickworks and several assault guns concealed among the buildings. There was little cover, and they were quickly pinned down. By this time, the 5th Seaforth's 3 companies were across the Rhine and miraculously had suffered no casualties. A platoon of 275 Field Company Royal Engineers and the artillery FOO's party had crossed with them. Together, they moved to their assembly point at Rees, where they soon came under sporadic but intense bursts of artillery and mortar fire.
We didn't actually dig in, as far as I remember, because we were waiting to move up as soon as we could, and it was certainly a time of apprehension.
We were trying to take shelter in ditches, behind hedges, anywhere at all. Tank tracks even would provide a little cover, but it was an atrocious bombardment. So we began to take casualties. And as we moved forward to Esserdon, we again thought, well, this is us on the move. We didn't dig in again, and we got the same thing at Esserdon. So it was a dreadful day.
Around midday, they were ordered to move again. The shelling and mortaring continued, and they came under heavy machine gun and small arms fire from uncleared positions on both sides of their route. Then they were held up by the rear of the 5th Camerons column, since the battle for the brickworks was far from over.
And certainly they were held up. There was strong opposition from the buildings, which ultimately I learned were the brickworks. And they were late getting into there, and they had ultimately to whistle up the Typhoons. But when they came in, and they came in quite low over our heads and put the rockets down, the Germans soon came out then.
Some did, but by no means all. And there were also the assault guns to contend with.
We were in one of the big communication trenches, and we were within 20 yards of one of the Sherman tanks that was hit, and it exploded straight away. This seemed to be one of the weaknesses. The Sherman tank would explode, and we wondered what it was like. We never saw anyone get out, so presumably the crew was entirely killed in the explosion.
Later on in the day, Colonel Sim and Derek Lang went to brigade to get orders for the attack on Groin. They landed in the middle of Stonk and had to shelter in, as they say, tank tracks, which were possibly only 8 inches deep, but they reckoned that without them they would have been killed. They arrived at brigade. Brigadier had been wounded, but was carrying on, and he said that the divisional commander had been killed, but he didn't want this information to be passed on to the men at this stage. It was a quite grievous wound to the division to lose our commander at that stage.
The brickworks were so strongly defended that a further attack had been delayed until after dark. Once captured, the 5th Seaforths would launch their attack on Groin. The overall situation in the 51st Highland Division's bridgehead was that 153 Brigade had 1 battalion pinned down east of Rees and 2 battalions meeting fierce resistance in the west of the town. Since all 5 bridging sites were still under enemy observation, it had only been possible to start work on one of them, and the engineers were suffering many casualties. The use of close support rafts had been seriously disrupted by heavy and accurate shelling, but 4 Class 50-60 rafts were operating at 2 sites, though the one nearest Rees was frequently under fire. On the left, 154 Brigade was encountering stiff opposition in Bienen, and the 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade was preparing to advance on Millingen. In the 152 Brigade area, the 2nd Seaforths, now back under command, had secured the area round a factory north of Rees, and the 5th Camerons were preparing to renew their attack on the brickworks. But for the 5th Seaforths, using every scrap of cover, the long wait continued. Such was the overall picture at 2200 hours on March the 24th, as Colonel Sim held his Battalion O group in an isolated cottage.
As I entered this cellar, I realized that there was a lot of tension, and in a way I felt these chaps were very anxious to get on with the battle the next day, because they'd been holed up for the day under fire, but unable to return anything and awaiting their turn to go into action. We were given our orders, our maps were all marked up, we were given timings for meeting, our watches were synchronized, and it was the first time I'd ever attended, of course, an O group of in action, and I sensed all the seriousness and the worry on everybody's faces.
He had just finished giving out the orders for the attack on Groin when it received a direct hit. The ceiling came down around us and we came out covered in plaster. It had been one terrible day, but at least we felt now we're going to close with the enemy and be able to do something about it.
The battalion would move to the forming up place west of the railway line, which was the line of departure. The mission was to capture the bridge over the anti-tank ditch and establish a bridgehead. The plan was for A Company to capture most of the hamlet. Then C Company would capture the remainder of Groin and the Hollandshof complex. And finally, D Company would pass through to capture the crossing and establish the bridgehead. In the second phase, A Company would capture 2 small hamlets north of the bridgehead, and C Company the large convent at House Aspel. The 5th Camerons attacked the brickworks at 22:30 hours, and at 00:15 hours on March the 25th, the 5th Seaforths began their approach march.
An incident happened where I was in the darkness, was aware of a man just in front of me, as we were this time, and I said, "Come on," gave him a shove, and he fell over sideways. He was dead, and he must have been dead for some time because rigor mortis had set in, and he just fell sideways, and that gave me a bit of a shock. However, we kept moving forward, and the night was going on. I don't know what time it could possibly have been, but we were getting very tired by this stage.
There was the usual hold-up. The road ahead was covered with tree trunks and dead animals and all sorts of things. It was very, very difficult approach march.
I was quite unaware of being wounded. I found myself crawling in the street, in the roadway, and I called for my platoon sergeant, Sergeant Goldby, to come forward from the rear of the platoon to take over. And then I was helped. I remember we opened the door of a house, a neighbouring house, and went down a very steep stair into a cellar. My leg was broken just above the ankle, and we went down into the cellar, which was lighted by a candle. And in the cellar was a large bed in which there was a mother and 2 daughters. And we looked at each other by candlelight. It was very dull. And the mother got out of bed, came across the bottom of the stairs, and helped me into bed with their 2 blonde girls.
By 0100 hours, the Camerons had cleared most of the brickworks. The 5th Seaforths had reached the forming up place, just behind their line of departure, for the attack on Groin, which would be led by A Company.
I expressed a bit of apprehension, because by that time the brickworks were on fire, or building around the brickworks, and the start line had been fixed at a railway line, and I said, between the railway line, the Cameron brickworks and Groin, we will be silhouetted. And I said, can't we have the start line moved? And Hector Mackenzie said, no, we can't have that because it fits in with the other start lines. So I said, well, we're going to be sitting ducks here. They'll probably see us lining up.
He was reassured by his company commander, Major Mackenzie, who reminded him about the massive artillery support for the battalion's attack. Not only would a total of 240 guns participate in the hour-long fire plan, nicknamed Champagne Love, the 12 30-tube launchers of the 1st Canadian Rocket Battery would fire up to 8 salvos. But the artillery was supporting the 5th Camerons, and the 5th Seaforths attack was delayed until the guns became available. Eventually, the bombardment began at 01:45 hours, and at 0200 hours, A Company crossed the line of departure. The artillery stopped firing at 02:35 hours, 10 minutes earlier than planned, probably because the infantry had closed on Groin faster than expected.
I left the platoon sergeant in charge of my platoon headquarters, and I liked to go in the centre. If we went two sections forward and one back, then I went between the 2 sections so that I knew where I was going and make sure that I got under the objective. And that was the system which we adopted when we were attacking Groin.
A Company's approach was checked briefly by somebody finding some mines or suspecting that there were mines there, and I know I went forward, but we only found 3, very hastily laid, not even properly covered, and quite easily dealt with.
The enemy's mining was negligible, but not his artillery and mortar fire. The battalion's axis was directly in line with the German observation post and the blazing brickworks. Lieutenant Lyle's misgivings proved well-founded.
Obviously, they must have seen us. We got the morning minis. These were the 6-inch mortars which came over in batches of 24, 36. But they were quite effective, unfortunately. I was knocked out by morning mini, which fell probably about 2 yards away, something like that, just on the right, because my injury was through the ankle. The shrapnel came straight through the boot, burst the laces. There's a bit of blood, nothing to write home about. But it knocked me out, and so I gave Sergeant Sutherland my map and field glasses and said, best of luck and look after the lads and we'll be in touch.
We moved up even further, and I was told that I should not move the company forward until A Company had taken the first objective, which was a farm on the outskirts of the village itself. So when I arrived there, they were still fighting in the fort, and as a number of buildings were on fire, all I could see were our own lads dashing about from one building to another. Heavy fire, Brennan, Spandau going on, George Lyle fighting his way into the objective, but obviously he still didn't have the objective. And I was getting a bit worried, as I think Colonel Sim was, that at 2:30 in the morning there were only 3 hours of darkness left. So he told me to attack immediately.
By this stage, C Company had already suffered 6 casualties, and being ordered to help capture A Company's original objectives was a fundamental change of plan. Major Robertson's war had started 3 years earlier at El Alamein, but his platoon commanders were far less experienced.
During the approach march, Lieutenant Findlay was wounded, and this left me with 2 very junior platoon commanders who had just arrived from England. They had no previous battle experience whatever. And unfortunately for them, they chose a bad night to grow up.
The head of C Company's column was halted about here, and Major Robertson decided on a 2-platoon attack. He held Lieutenant Rhodes's 15 platoon in reserve and sent 14 platoon, now commanded by Sergeant Goldney, on a wide flanking move round the farm where A Company was held up to fight through the centre of the village. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Stone's 13 platoon was to attack the House Groon farm complex. The intention was to work through the buildings from the north.
We got within, what, 50 yards of it, when suddenly Spanders opened up. My God. Anyway, we carried on and they cleared that house. I didn't clear it, but that house was cleared and occupied. Now, when this had been happening, myself and a brain gunner, we skipped out to the right of the... And that was, I think, possibly the luckiest move I ever made that night, because it left the whole village silhouetted in flames. You could see every movement that was going on. And the thing that struck us was there was as many Boche moving about as what there was Jocks. And they were moving. When the Jocks moved one way, they moved the other. And the next thing you knew, it was the opposite way on. But we were in a great position to pick them off. But my goodness, we went along and learning that 2 shots from a rifle was just too much because the sponges were onto you, you know? So I says, we'll fire single shots, fire the shot and move a little bit and take a shot from the next one. Well, we carried on like that for a while.
Sergeant Smith's small group out on the right was experienced, unlike their platoon commander who was leading the battle for the buildings. It was his first time in action, and Major Robertson grew concerned.
There was a lot of firing going on, and I kept asking for reports, but none was forthcoming. So I decided to go forward and investigate myself. I took my runner with me. We found Mr. Stone in a shallow slit in an orchard quite near to the farm. And he was in a dreadful condition by that time. I asked him what was happening. He told me that they had attacked the first house. They had managed to close and get the first building. But when they formed up to go for the second building, they ran into a very heavy concentration of Spandau grenades, what have you. And at least one section was taken prisoner, and there were a number of casualties as well. At the time, he could only account for 8 men in his platoon. So I told him that I would get the reserve platoon, Lieutenant Rhodes, to do a right hook and try and get round behind the position. I had just told him this when a tatty masher landed about 3 yards away from me. I looked up, and coming around the corner of the nearest building, all I could see were a number of men with flashes coming from the middle, and they were shouting at the same time. I couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but it was enough to get me on my feet. And I took a beeline for the nearest hedge, jumped over it, landed in a heap in the field on the other side, and my runner landed beside me. He decided to get up and keep going, but I grabbed him and I said, "Stay where you are, don't move." And there happened to be a shell hole just beside us. So we crawled into the shell hole and lay there while the 5 Germans came along. There were 5 of them. Now I could see their faces quite clearly because the firelight from the burning buildings just brought them out. And when they came abreast of me, they were not more than 10 feet away, I can swear. We were almost frightened to breathe. Unfortunately for them, there was a Bren gun facing right up the hedge, which Sergeant Goldney had placed there just for such an eventuality. They walked straight into it. 3 were killed, 1 was wounded, the other was taken prisoner.
Having rejoined his company headquarters, Major Robertson's next move was to use Lieutenant Rhodes's 15 platoon to attack House Groon from the flank.
Again, there was a lot of shooting and what have you, but eventually his platoon also returned, but there were more of them than there were certainly in Mr. Stone's platoon. The commander, Lieutenant Rhodes, was wounded in the arm. They had left him, which I took a poor view of, but fortunately he managed to come in his own steam afterwards.
Though the battalion had failed to take House Groon, by now A Company had succeeded in gaining a foothold on the northern edge of the village. There was also better news from 14 platoon, which had been sent into Groon itself.
So I went forward and contacted St. Goldney, who was about halfway down the village, and I explained to him that we had to get the rest of the houses and we had to get astride the main road from Rees. This was most important. So I left him there and he set off. Meantime, I got the reserves from the other 2 platoons to come down and thicken up.
When I did get back amongst the lads, I discovered that the platoon that had gone down through the village was 14 platoon, which was run by Sergeant Goldney, a great friend of mine. Right towards the bottom end of the village, a German officer had got up from the ditch and came straight up to Goldney, and at point blank range shot him through the heart. He just dropped dead, which 3 lads did not like at all, so they sent in 3 complimentary Mills grenades into the ditch where he jumped back in again, so he would quickly follow Goldney that night, I'll bet. But that was the feeling that we had. No, you've done it, so take it. And they were getting it, believe me.
Oh, it was quite grim because a number of the houses were on fire. Roofs were caving in, sparks flying all over the place. There were cattle trapped in some of those buildings, being slowly burned to death. The smell of burning flesh and hide was simply awful, quite sickening. The whole thing was almost like a dream. It didn't seem to be true, really, what was happening in front of us.
In spite of the loss of Sergeant Goldney, 14 platoon was astride the main road and had been reinforced by the remnants of 13 and 15 platoons. The enemy was still in House Groon, but since the rest of the village north of the main road had been taken, it was now outflanked. Colonel Sim now considered 2 options: to renew the attack on House Groon so as to protect his flank and rear, or to advance east to capture the bridge over the water obstacle, which was the battalion's ultimate objective. With Major Robertson's C Company now severely depleted, Colonel Sim turned to D Company, commanded by Captain Jock Gardner, who decided to go for House Groon. It was 04:45 hours, and there was only an hour of darkness left. He ordered his company forward to the buildings at the T-junction via the eastern track, 17 platoon leading, followed by 16 and 18 platoons, after which he moved to the T-junction with his company tactical headquarters. Unknown to Captain Gardner, his company inexplicably used the central route and was probably observed by the enemy from the houses south of the main road, for as 17 platoon was getting organized at the T-junction, it came under heavy fire from that direction. Captain Gardner had decided to clear these buildings, which threatened his flank and rear, before attacking House Groon. He deployed the remnants of C Company's platoons to protect his flank, and ordered Lieutenant Bill Manson's 16 platoon to attack the houses. The platoon soon suffered 6 casualties and was pinned down by heavy fire from the central house and trenches on the flanks and behind the houses. To assess the situation for himself, Captain Gardner went forward to Lieutenant Manson and quickly devised a new plan. 16 platoon was to fire everything it had at the house, including its mortar and pier, while a section from 17 platoon worked round to the rear of the positions. Corporal Purchase volunteered his 5 section for the job and would move along the ditch and round the last building. Sergeant Tom Smith was also able to fire at the enemy trench positions.
It must have been miserable for them, really, because whenever they got their head up, they were getting something through their ear, you know. They kept on doing that. The next thing we knew was there's 2-inch mortar bombs, smoke and HE dropping in front of the house. Well, that was great. At least our lads are going to get a chance to get in.
Already 5 section, led by Corporal Purchase, was moving along the ditch. Purchase and Private Gray, the Bren gunner, made it across the little bridge, but the rest of the section was spotted and pinned down. Purchase and Gray continued alone, dashed round the end house and charged the enemy.
At that particular stage, I don't know what had happened or how it came about, but we heard somebody shouting, "Give up, you... The C-Force are here." I heard that shouted twice. Then some Spandau bursts.
Fearing the worst, with the Germans distracted and hell-bent on revenge, 16 platoon and the rest of 5 section rushed the centre building and the trenches beyond. 46 paratroopers were captured, together with 3 machine guns. Corporal Purchase's heroism earned him a mention in dispatches, but cost him his life. Private Gray won the DCM, and though seriously wounded, he survived. 8 German soldiers were on the stairs, and 15 civilians were in the cellar of the house which Purchase and Gray had rounded. They included the owner's son, who was 9 years old at the time.
About 05:30 hours, my father and grandfather went out to the back to tend and feed the animals. They saw the British troops in the ditches along the roadside. Then my father and grandfather said they wanted the German soldiers to leave so that nothing would happen to the civilians. The soldiers left the house, but they set fire to it, and as a result, we were forced to leave.
Now that the houses had been taken, D Company turned its attention to House Groen, which Lieutenant Flynn's 18 platoon attacked energetically just after dawn. There was determined resistance, but in half an hour it had been taken. Members of 13 platoon who had been wounded and captured were found in the cellars. D Company's losses so far amounted to 2 killed and 10 wounded. In the meantime, Lieutenant Hewitt's troop of tanks had been moving forward since before dawn.
There were, of course, signs of battle everywhere. The houses had been badly knocked about. There were dead Germans lying everywhere in the road, dead cattle, vehicles driving back from further forward with wounded people in. However, one had to stick to one's orders, and we proceeded forward until I met up with the commander of the company which I was to support. And he was rather pleased to see me, I think.
As the tanks arrived at the T-junction, they were seen by the stockmans, who were fleeing from their burning home.
A tank came out of the Groen Alley and stopped on the main road, where it came under machine gun fire from the brickworks. I heard the bullets hitting the tank, but it didn't know where the fire was coming from, so it fired on the nearest house, and the gable end collapsed.
This could have been unfortunate, since the house was in the area where elements of C Company were deployed to protect D Company's flank. It was an incident typical of the confusion and chaos of battle. But Groen had been taken, and throughout the morning, as the battalion dug in, the civilians took stock. Hanny Franken lived in a house on the outskirts of the village beside the battalion's axis. She was 19 at the time.
Wir waren natürlich ängstlich, aber wir wurden überrascht.
We were scared, of course, but we were surprised that they were so considerate. On the first evening, or the next morning, a British soldier came into the cellar. and set cans on a small wall, pulled the cap off one and set light to it. We were really frightened. We thought he was going to blow us up. They were food tins, and when they were warm, he shared them with us. We had had nothing to eat for 4 days.
Groin had been taken, but Rees had not, for the all-volunteer 1st Parachute Army Assault Battalion was resisting fiercely. In the face of the Allies' overwhelming resources, the outcome, though still some way away, was inevitable. And on the 25th of March, Hauptmann Hubner moved his headquarters to Haus Aspel, the large convent east of Groin, which dominated the surrounding countryside, and the small bridge, which was the 5th Seaforth's ultimate Phase 1 objective. Colonel Sim had been given the choice of attacking the battalion's remaining objectives by night, but he felt that with no bridges over the Rhine, the presence of tanks would be unexpected. He decided to exploit this surprise as soon as possible by using D Company to capture the brickworks and Hollandshof. Cover was scant, so Captain Gardner, the company commander, decided that his infantry would advance along the roadside ditches. 2 of the tanks were to have moved round the flank, but the wireless in one of them failed before the start of this move and took no part in the action. The other was ordered to follow the troop commander's tank, which would move on the main road with the leading platoon together with the company commander. The attack started at 1400 hours.
I gave him the intercom telephone so that I could speak directly to him as he walked along at the back of the tank. We advanced slowly down this road. The Seaforths were crawling along in the ditches on either side of the road. I was very glad I wasn't an infantryman. I expect they were equally glad they weren't in my tank, which was a very obvious target.
The first part of the attack was easy. Lieutenant Manson's 16 platoon cleared the brickworks buildings unopposed, after which Lieutenant Evans's 17 platoon took over the lead and advanced on Hollandshof.
So the next thing that happened, you could see the platoons changing. Another one went forward on the big farm. And everybody else was thinking, this is great, they're not in here either. Well, when they got about 50 yards from it, dearie me, I have never seen such withering fire as one was. Every goddamn window in Hollandshof had guns sticking out. They're sticking out of trenches and they were all blazing.
On top of this, the enemy brought down heavy concentrations of mortar and artillery fire. The 6-strong section on the left charged out of the ditch. All but one of them were mown down. The right-hand section got within 12 meters of the farm. A phosphorus grenade was thrown at them, which together with machine gun fire killed or wounded 4 of the 6 men. One man's battle dress was ablaze. His rescuer's hands were badly burned. Lieutenant Evans called for smoke, but there was no one left to do it. Of the 12 men in the 2 leading sections, 10 had been killed or wounded. 17 Platoon HQ gave covering fire as the stretcher bearers went to work. While Lieutenant Evans strived to reorganize the remnants of his platoon and the 2 tanks fired at the buildings, Captain Gardner sent Lieutenant Flynn's 18 platoon round the right flank. The small orchard offered precious little cover from the Hollandshof and none at all from the Germans in the area of Haus Aspel, about 250 meters away. Lieutenant Flynn was killed, and his platoon went to ground in the hurricane of small arms, artillery and mortar fire. Back around the brickworks, the mortaring was also inflicting casualties on 16 platoon, but its commander, Lieutenant Bill Manson, moved forward and did good work reactivating the leading platoons until he was badly wounded in the eye. Captain Gardner was left with just Lieutenant Evans and 3 NCOs to command his remaining men. Nevertheless, he decided to make one last effort, putting the survivors of all 3 platoons under Evans and supported by the 2 tanks.
We proceeded along the road until we were in a very short distance from the final objective, which was a large farmhouse and set of buildings, which we had by that time fired a great number of rounds into. But there was still resistance, and at that point I was asked if I would please direct fire at very close quarters into the base of this last farmhouse.
But all of a sudden the tank opened up along with its neighbour on Hollandshof, the front of Hollandshof. And it was wicked. It did sort of quieten the Spaniards for a little while.
Hard on the heels of the tank fire, D Company stormed and cleared the first building, but not without further losses, including Lance Sergeant Hall, who was wounded when a grenade he tossed into the cellar rebounded off wire netting, which the German paras had stretched across the entrance. While the battle raged, a few hundred meters away at House Aspel, 10-year-old local boy Wilhelm Buckerman stuck close to his father.
My father was talking to some soldiers who were asking about the best way to approach House Hollandshof. As far as I can remember, a soldier was then tasked to take an anti-tank weapon, I presume a Panzerfaust, to destroy the tank that had been observed standing static at Hollandshof.
Having secured the first building, D Company was left with just 15 men able to fight on, and no way could be found into the large barn behind the house. So Captain Gardner asked Lieutenant Hewitt to blast a way in, though his tank was running short of ammunition. After a few rounds, the gable end collapsed. But before the infantry could rush in,
there was the most enormous explosion, and my tank was hit in the front. And set on fire.
There's somebody suddenly climbed on top of the tank and started to haul them out from the tank. So it was one of our platoon HQ lads. And they got them out. The other thing was, the second tank, of course, which is quite near it, when the bazooka hit the first one, was just about off. And I can remember the officer seeing him quite plainly, hammering on the tank with a shovel, and they turned and they gave Hollandshof what they had.
On seeing the second tank starting to withdraw, an enraged Captain Gardner had chased after it and demanded supporting fire while both tank and infantry casualties were evacuated, and he withdrew his decimated D Company back to Groin.
I remember sitting on the back of this tank and feeling a bit shaken, and I was very pleased when one of the chaps in the tank offered me a bottle of whiskey which he'd got hidden away, and I think I swallowed most of that bottle, which probably kept me going for the next 48 hours quite well.
His face and hands were burned, and he had been wounded in the knee. It was the end of the war for Lieutenant Hewitt, but not for Lieutenant Evans.
He was certainly highly excited, very close to tears. When he was trying to describe it to us and what had happened, he was frustrated at not getting his final thrust home. And as he'd been crawling about in ditches and things, he was quite dishevelled and quite severely shaken. But my own platoon sergeant, Jock Moore, was an experienced veteran from the Alamein days, and he knew what was best, and we always had a water bottle in the platoon which had a whiskey, which was filled with whiskey, and we gave him a good dose of whiskey, and he went happily on his way to reforming. I'm sure it did him a power of good.
The battle had continued throughout the afternoon. Hollandshof had not been taken. D Company, probably no more than 90 strong at the outset, had now lost 6 killed and 33 wounded, not counting any casualties suffered during the approach march. Colonel Sim always regretted his decision to order a daylight attack. Elsewhere, on March the 25th, the enemy OPs in Rees were captured by 10:30 hours, and bridge construction at last got into its stride. By nightfall, all resistance in the town had ended. But the 5th Seaforths had more to do. At 2300 hours, A Company launched a set-piece attack on Holland's Hof. It was unoccupied, but when a patrol approached the bridge over the anti-tank ditch, it came under heavy fire and withdrew. The same night, the first bridge across the Rhine in the 30 Corps area was opened, and on March the 26th, Churchill picnicked east of the Rhine with Field Marshals Alan Brooke and Montgomery. Only 8 kilometers away, the 5th Seaforths were patrolling and mopping up under heavy artillery fire. At 1700 hours, Germans were observed forming up east of Holland's Hof, but their counterattack was broken up before it began by artillery fire, the battalion's mortars, and the medium machine guns of the Middlesex Regiment, which had now linked up with the battalion. The ultimate objective had still not been captured, but after dark, a patrol from C Company found the small but vital bridge intact, and at 22:45 hours, a platoon from A Company was sent forward to occupy it. The job had been done, but the battalion had lost 25 killed and 112 wounded.
Wir durften den Keller verlassen, weil der Artilleriebeschuss ja zu Ende war.
We were allowed to leave the cellar because the artillery fire had stopped, and we came out into the yard at the back of the house. An emergency dressing station had been set up, and the wounded soldiers were being attended to. The dead soldiers lay on the cobbled yard. I must say it was a terrible sight. They were covered by tarpaulins, but we knew what was underneath. It was a terrible shock for us. So many young people lying in a row. They were buried here in front of the house in a temporary graveyard. There were 26 of them.
Even in a company, I mean, with 3 platoons in it, I mean, everybody knew everybody else. But when you come to lose 12 or 14 men, everybody's lost a pal. Everybody's lost somebody that they know, certainly. It was more vicious, by far the most vicious battle ever I fought in. And it was contained in a much smaller area than ever I had fought in. Every individual house had to be fought for. And all the para-boys, wherever we met them, you could only say they were really skilled soldiers. Very clever soldiers, really, and with enough fanaticism to spur the ones on that was slightly behind them. I think they used to call them playmates in the battalion, but there were no playmates, believe me. Vicious little sods.
Well, it was down a bit because we had obviously taken very, very heavy casualties. And even with 3 companies, we would probably be down by that time to about 1.5, I would think, in real terms, strength. And however, it's quite amazing how one just said, well, that's war, let's get on with it. So you prepare for the next one.
Two days later, having received some reinforcements, the battalion was back in action.